Corporate lawyer evicts elderly couple for new parking lot. Couple's hidden past brings multinational company to its knees. Hello? Welcome. Leave a like, subscribe, activate notifications, and enjoy the story. They were just two elderly souls living in a quiet corner of the city, clinging to the last piece of their past. Martha and Samuel had faced their share of hardships, but nothing prepared them for this. The knock on their door wasn't just a formality. It was the start of a nightmare. A cold, heartless corporate lawyer had arrived, papers in hand, to rip away the only home they had left. But what seemed like a simple eviction would unravel a secret so powerful, it would shake an entire corporatio. As the world moves on without them, Martha and Samuel are left with a devastating choice: surrender to the system or fight back against impossible odds. Little did anyone know, the quiet couple held something far more valuable than land. And when that secret finally comes to light, it will leave everyone, especially the ones trying to destroy them, in utter shock. Prepare yourself for a story of loss, resilience, and a truth that will leave you breathless. Because sometimes the most unassuming people carry the heaviest burdens, and their past might just bring a giant to its knees. The sharp knock on the door pierced the tranquil silence of the small, worn-down house on Maple Street. Inside, Martha and Samuel Thompson, both in their mid-80s, exchanged a knowing glance. They had been dreading this moment for weeks. Samuel's arthritic hands trembled as he slowly rose from his threadbare armchair. Martha reached out, gently squeezing his arm. "Together, my love," she whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. As Samuel opened the door, they were confronted by a tall, impeccably dressed man in his early 40s. His cold, steely gaze swept over the elderly couple, taking in their shabby clothes and the faded wallpaper behind them. "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson?" he asked, his voice devoid of warmth. "I'm Jason Hartley, representing Apex Development Corporation. I'm here to serve you with an eviction notice." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Martha's grip on Samuel's arm tightened, her knuckles turning white. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Jason brushed past them, entering the small living room without waiting for an invitation. His eyes darted around, taking in the faded photographs that covered nearly every inch of wall space. Black and white images of a young couple, full of life and hope, stared back at him. As Jason began reading the formal eviction notice, his words became a dull buzz in the background. Martha's mind wandered to the life she and Samuel had built in this humble home over the past 6 decades. Every crack in the plaster, every creaky floorboard held a memory. Samuel's eyes fixed on a particular photograph, a snapshot of them on their wedding day in 1955. They were standing in front of this very house, paint fresh and garden blooming. It was supposed to be their forever home. "You have 30 days to vacate the premises," Jason's voice cut through their reverie. "Apex Development will commence construction of the new parking lot immediately after." Martha's eyes welled with tears. "But this is our home," she pleaded, her voice barely above a whisper. "We've lived here our entire married life. Where will we go?" Jason's expression remained impassive. "I understand this is difficult, Mrs. Thompson, but the decision is final. Apex has legally acquired this land. Your lease agreement expired years ago." Samuel's jaw clenched, a fire igniting in his eyes that Martha hadn't seen in years. "Young man," he said, his voice surprisingly steady, "do you have any idea what this house means to us? What we've been through?" For a split second, Jason's professional facade cracked. There was something in the old man's tone, a weight of history that made him pause. His eyes were drawn to a small, framed photograph on the mantel. A much younger Samuel and Martha, their expressions haunted, with what looked like tattooed numbers on their forearms. Shaking off his momentary discomfort, Jason straightened his tie. "I'm just doing my job, Mr. Thompson. I suggest you start making arrangements to move." As Jason turned to leave, Samuel suddenly gripped Martha's hand. "Meine Liebe," he whispered in German, "es ist Zeit, unsere Wahrheit zu erzählen." "My love, it's time to tell our truth." Martha's eyes widened in shock. They had kept their secret for so long, buried it deep beneath decades of silence and nightmares. But now, faced with losing the only safe haven they had known since the war, She knew Samuel was right. It was time. Jason, hand on the doorknob, turned back. "Is there anything else?" Samuel looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and determination. "Yes, Mr. Hartley. There's something you need to know. Something that will change everything." The old man's words hung in the air, charged with an intensity that made Jason's skin prickle. For the first time since entering the house, he truly looked at the couple before him. He saw beyond their age, beyond their apparent frailty. In their eyes, he glimpsed a depth of experience and resilience that shook him to his core. Martha moved to the mantel, picking up the photograph Jason had noticed earlier. With trembling hands, she held it out to him. "This was taken in 1945, she said softly, "just after we were liberated from Auschwitz." The revelation hit Jason like a physical blow. He stared at the image, at the hollow-cheeked young couple with numbers tattooed on their arms. The same couple who now stood before him, survivors of unimaginable horrors, about to be evicted from their home of 6 decades for a parking lot. Samuel's voice, strong despite his years, filled the room. "We came to America with nothing but the clothes on our backs and the nightmares that haunted our sleep. This house, Mr. Hartley, is more than just bricks and mortar. It's our refuge, our promise to each other that we would build a life filled with love despite the darkness we had witnessed." Jason found himself sinking into the nearest chair, the eviction notice falling from his suddenly numb fingers. The weight of what he was doing, of the lives he was uprooting, crashed down upon him. Martha continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. "We've never asked for special treatment. We've lived quiet lives, grateful for each day. But now, faced with losing our home, we can't stay silent any longer." As the elderly couple began to share their story, Jason listened, transfixed. The neat corporate world he had inhabited just hours ago seemed to crumble around him. In its place, a narrative of survival, love, and quiet heroism unfolded. By the time Samuel and Martha finished speaking, the sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the room. Jason stood up, his legs unsteady, his worldview irrevocably altered. "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. I don't know what to say. I had no idea. I won't do this." He picked up the eviction notice, tearing it in half. Samuel and Martha exchanged a look of cautious hope. "What does this mean?" Martha asked. Jason ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. "I don't know exactly, but I promise you this, I will fight for you. Your story, your home, it's too important. Apex Development needs to know the truth." As Jason left the house that evening, he knew his life had changed forever. The image of Samuel and Martha standing resilient in their small living room, surrounded by the memories of a life built from the ashes of unimaginable tragedy, was seared into his mind. The battle was far from over, but in that moment, on a quiet street in suburban America, the first shot had been fired. A corporate giant was about to face a force far more powerful than money or influence, the unyielding strength of the human spirit. As Jason Hartley's car disappeared around the corner, Martha and Samuel Thompson stood in their doorway holding each other tightly. The weight of their decision to reveal their past hung heavy in the air. "Do you think we did the right thing, Samuel?" Martha whispered, her voice trembling. Samuel kissed her forehead gently. "We had no choice, meine Liebe, it was time." They shuffled back into their living room, each step a reminder of the life they had built and were now fighting to keep. As they settled into their worn armchairs, the tick of the old grandfather clock seemed to grow louder, marking the passage of time that had brought them to this moment. Martha's eyes drifted to a small, ornate box on the mantel. With a deep breath, she stood and retrieved it, her hands shaking slightly as she opened the lid. Inside lay a collection of yellowed papers, faded photographs, and 2 small strips of fabric with numbers crudely stitched onto them. As Samuel watched, Martha spread the contents on the coffee table between them. Memories long suppressed began to surface. "Auschwitz, 1944. Samuel murmured, his eyes fixed on a grainy photograph of emaciated prisoners. "I can still smell it, Martha. The smoke, the fear." Martha nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "I remember the day we met," she said softly. "Even in that hell, you found a way to smile at me." The room seemed to fade away as their minds drifted back to that fateful day. Auschwitz-Birkenau, Poland, summer 1944. The sun beat down mercilessly on the prisoners as they toiled in the camp's factory. 17-year-old Sarah Goldstein, who would later become Martha, struggled to keep up with the demands of the Nazi overseers. Her once nimble fingers, now bony and weak from months of near starvation, fumbled with the machinery. Suddenly, a commotion erupted nearby. A young man had collapsed, his body giving out after weeks of grueling labor and meager rations. As the guards descended on him, Sarah found herself moving without thinking. She knelt beside the fallen prisoner, shielding him from the first blow of the guard's baton. "Please," she begged in broken German, "let me help him up. He can still work." The guard hesitated, then nodded curtly. Sarah helped the young man to his feet, supporting him as they returned to their stations. As she turned to go back to her own work, the young man caught her eye. "Danke," he whispered, a ghost of a smile crossing his gaunt face. "I'm Samuel." In that moment, amidst the horror and despair, a spark of human connection ignited between them. It was a spark that would sustain them through the darkest days to come. Back in the present, Martha wiped a tear from her cheek. "You saved my life that day, Samuel. If the guards had seen me falter..." Samuel reached across the table, clasping her hand in his. "And you saved mine, my love. More times than I can count." As they continued to sift through the mementos of their past, the phone rang, startling them both. Martha answered, her voice cautious. "Mrs. Thompson, it's Jason Hartley," came the voice on the other end. I couldn't sleep last night. I've been doing some research, and I think I've found something that might help us fight this eviction. Can I come by tomorrow to discuss it?" Martha's eyes met Samuel's, a glimmer of hope shining through. "Yes, Mr. Hartley, we'll be here." As she hung up the phone, Samuel leaned forward, his expression serious. "Martha, if we're going to do this, we need to be prepared to face everything. All the memories, all the pain we've buried for so long." Martha nodded slowly. "I know, Samuel, but we owe it to ourselves, to everyone we lost, to fight for our home. It's all we have left of the life we built after everything." That night, as they lay in bed, neither Samuel nor Martha could sleep. Their minds raced with memories long suppressed, the cattle cars, the selection lines, the constant hunger and fear. But interwoven with these dark recollections were moments of incredible humanity, secret acts of kindness, whispered words of hope, and the unbreakable bond that had formed between them. As dawn broke, casting a soft light through their bedroom window, Martha turned to Samuel. "Whatever happens, my love, we face it together, just as we always have." Samuel squeezed her hand gently. "Together," he agreed. They rose slowly, preparing for the day ahead. As Martha made coffee, her hand still steady despite her years, Samuel stood at the living room window. He watched as their neighbors began their morning routines, blissfully unaware of the battle brewing on their quiet suburban street. A determined glint appeared in Samuel's eye. They had survived hell itself. They had rebuilt their lives from nothing. And now, as twilight approached, they would fight one last time, not just for themselves, but for the memory of all those who never had the chance to build a life, to find a home. The clock on the mantel chimed 8 times. In a few hours, Jason Hartley would arrive, and the next chapter of their extraordinary journey would begin. Samuel and Martha Thompson, survivors, fighters, and beacons of resilience, were ready. Little did the corporate giants at Apex Development know, but their world was about to be turned upside down by 2 elderly immigrants with a story that would shake the very foundations of their empire. The sharp rap on the door came precisely at 10 a.m. Martha smoothed her dress nervously as Samuel opened the door to reveal Jason Hartley. The young lawyer looked different today, his perfectly pressed suit replaced by jeans and a button-down shirt, dark circles under his eyes betraying a sleepless night. "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson," Jason nodded, his voice softer than before. "Thank you for seeing me." As they settled in the living room, the tension was palpable. Jason pulled out a thick folder from his briefcase, spreading documents across the coffee table. "I've been up all night researching Apex Development's history," he began, his voice tight. "What I found, it's not good. The company has a pattern of targeting vulnerable communities for their projects. But your case? It could be the key to bringing them down." Martha leaned forward, her eyes sharp. What do you mean, Mr. Hartley? Jason took a deep breath. Apex's founder, William Blackstone, has carefully hidden his family's past. But I've uncovered evidence linking his grandfather to Nazi-confiscated properties during World War II. The very wealth that built Apex. It's blood money. The revelation hung heavy in the air. Samuel's hand found Martha's, squeezing it tightly. So you see, Jason continued, his voice gaining strength, this isn't just about saving your home anymore, it's about justice. For you and for countless others. As Jason outlined his plan to challenge the eviction in court, citing historical injustice and the Thompsons' status as Holocaust survivors, a fire seemed to ignite in the elderly couple's eyes. It won't be easy, Jason warned. Apex has deep pockets and an army of lawyers, but if we can get your story out there, if we can make the public see what's really happening. Samuel stood suddenly, moving to the bookshelf. He pulled out an old leather-bound journal. Then perhaps it's time the world knew the whole truth, he said, his voice steady. This journal, I've kept it hidden for decades. It details everything. Names, dates, locations. The atrocities we witnessed, the lives lost, and yes, the property stolen. Martha gasped. Samuel, are you sure? He nodded solemnly. It's time, my love. We've carried this burden long enough. As Samuel handed the journal to Jason, the young lawyer felt the weight of history in his hands. This could change everything, he whispered. The next few hours were a whirlwind of strategy and storytelling. Jason listened, transfixed as Samuel and Martha recounted their experiences in more detail, the horrors they'd endured, the strength they'd found in each other, and the quiet life they'd built in America. As afternoon faded into evening, a plan began to take shape. Jason would file an injunction to halt the eviction, while simultaneously reaching out to investigative journalists to expose Apex's dark history. We'll need to move fast, Jason explained. Once we file, Apex will come at us with everything they've got. Martha stood, her back straight despite her years. Let them come, she said, her voice steely. We've faced worse and survived. As Jason prepared to leave, Samuel stopped him at the door. Young man, he said, his eyes boring into Jason's. Why are you doing this? You're risking your career, your future. Jason was quiet for a moment. Because it's right, he finally said. And because my grandmother was a Holocaust survivor too. She died when I was young, but her stories, they shaped who I am. I can't stand by and watch this happen. Not again, not ever. With a final nod, Jason left, leaving Samuel and Martha to contemplate the battle ahead. That night, as they lay in bed, Martha turned to Samuel. Are we ready for this, my love, to relive it all? Samuel pulled her close. We must be, he whispered. For those who can no longer speak. For the life we've built. For each other, as they drifted off to sleep. Memories of their past mingled with visions of the fight to come. In the quiet of their modest home, two survivors steeled themselves for one last stand against the forces that had sought to destroy them so long ago. Little did they know, their story was about to capture the hearts of millions, igniting a firestorm that would shake Apex development to its very core. Across town in a sleek high-rise office, William Blackstone III, CEO of Apex Development, received a late-night call. Sir, his assistant's voice trembled. We have a problem. A big one. As Blackstone listened to the unfolding situation, his face paled. The past he'd tried so hard to bury was about to come to light. And two elderly survivors held the key to his downfall. The stage was set. David versus Goliath. The battle for justice, decades in the making, was about to begin. The morning sun had barely crept over the horizon when Jason Hartley's phone began to buzz incessantly. Bleary-eyed, he fumbled for the device, his heart racing as he saw the flood of notifications. The story had broken. Holocaust survivors fight corporate giant. Nazi-linked fortune exposed, screamed the headline from the New York Times. Similar headlines flashed across his screen from other major news outlets. Jason's hands shook as he dialed the Thompsons' number. Mr. Thompson, it's Jason. Turn on your TV now. Across town, Samuel and Martha sat stunned in their living room. watching as their faces flashed across the screen of every major news network. Their story, their pain, their fight, all laid bare for the world to see. "Oh, Samuel," Martha whispered, gripping his hand tightly. "What have we done?" Before Samuel could respond, a sharp knock at the door made them both jump. Jason burst in, his tie askew and his eyes wild. "I'm so sorry," he panted. "I didn't mean for it to break like this. Someone at the newspaper must have leaked it early." But as the initial shock wore off, a steely determination settled over Samuel's features. "No, son," he said, his voice steady. "This is exactly what needed to happen. The truth, after all these years. It's finally seeing the light of day." As the day wore on, the Thompsons' small home became the epicenter of a media storm. Reporters camped out on their lawn, camera crews jostled for position, and their phone rang off the hook with interview requests. Meanwhile, across the city in the gleaming Apex Development headquarters, William Blackstone III was in full crisis mode. Surrounded by a team of high-priced lawyers and PR specialists, he barked orders in a desperate attempt to contain the damage. "I want every document related to my grandfather's activities during the war locked down," he snarled. "And get me everything you can on these Thompsons. There has to be something we can use to discredit them." But as Blackstone's team dug deeper, they uncovered a truth far more damning than they could have imagined. Hidden in the company's oldest records, they found a series of letters between Blackstone's grandfather and high-ranking Nazi officials, detailing the systematic theft of Jewish-owned properties across Europe. Jason, still reeling from the media frenzy, found himself facing the biggest moral dilemma of his career. As he pored over the documents Samuel had entrusted to him, he uncovered a connection that made his blood run cold. His own law firm, the very one that had assigned him to handle the Thompsons' eviction, had deep ties to Apex Development going back decades. With shaking hands, Jason dialed his managing partner's number. "Sir," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "we need to talk. It's about Apex, and it's bad." As night fell, the Thompsons sat in their living room, the weight of the day's events heavy on their shoulders. Martha turned to Samuel, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "Do you remember," she said softly, "the promise we made to each other in Auschwitz, that if we survived, we would live a life worthy of those who didn't?" Samuel nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "I remember, my love, every day. I think," Martha continued, her voice growing stronger, "that this is why we survived. For this moment, to ensure that the truth is known, that justice is served, not just for us, but for all those who can no longer speak for themselves." As they held each other, finding strength in their shared resolve, the world outside their small home continued to spin into chaos. News of the Apex scandal spread like wildfire, stocks plummeted, and calls for investigations echoed through the halls of power. In his plush office, William Blackstone stared out at the city skyline, the empire his family had built crumbling around him. His phone buzzed, another call from the board of directors, no doubt demanding his resignation. As dawn broke on a new day, the battle lines were drawn. On one side, a multinational corporation with endless resources and a dark secret to protect. On the other, an elderly couple armed with nothing but their truth and an unwavering determination to see justice done. And caught in the middle, a young lawyer named Jason Hartley, forced to confront not only the sins of his clients but the complicity of his own firm in a decades-long cover-up. The stage was set for a showdown that would rock the foundations of corporate America and force a nation to confront the long shadow of its past. As Samuel and Martha prepared to face the cameras and tell their story to the world, they knew that win or lose, their fight had already changed everything. The truth so long buried had finally come to light, and its revelation would set in motion a chain of events that would bring a multinational company to its knees and rewrite the very notion of justice in modern America. The sun had barely risen when the first news van pulled up outside the Thompsons' modest home. By mid-morning, Maple Street was a sea of reporters, camera crews, and curious onlookers. The quiet suburb had become the epicenter of a story that was captivating the nation. Inside, Martha nervously smoothed her dress for the 100th time. "Samuel, are you sure we're ready for this?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Samuel took her hand, his touch as reassuring as it had been for over 7 decades. "We've faced worse, meine Liebe. Much worse. We can do this." A knock at the door announced Jason's arrival. The young lawyer looked haggard, dark circles under his eyes betraying nights of little sleep. "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson," he said, his voice tight with tension. "It's time. Are you ready?" With a shared look of determination, Samuel and Martha stepped out onto their porch. The crowd fell silent, all eyes and cameras trained on the elderly couple. Samuel cleared his throat, his voice stronger than it had been in years. "My name is Samuel Thompson. This is my wife, Martha. 79 years ago, we met in Auschwitz-Birkenau. We survived horrors that no human should ever endure. And now, in our twilight years, we find ourselves fighting once again. Not against the Nazi regime, but against a corporation that seeks to profit from the suffering of millions." As Samuel spoke, recounting their experiences in the camp and their struggle to build a life in America, the crowd listened in stunned silence. Martha, her hand never leaving Samuel's, added her own memories, her voice breaking as she described the day they were liberated. "We thought we had left that darkness behind," she said, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "But the past has a way of catching up with us all. The company that seeks to take our home, Apex Development, was built on a fortune stolen from families like ours. Families who never had the chance to rebuild, to find their own piece of the American dream." As the Thompsons shared their story, social media exploded. Justice for the Thompsons began trending worldwide. Celebrities, politicians, and ordinary citizens alike shared the couple's story, calling for boycotts of Apex Development and its subsidiaries. In his high-rise office, William Blackstone watched the interview with growing horror. His phone wouldn't stop ringing. Board members demanding explanations, investors pulling out, partners distancing themselves from the toxic Apex brand. "Get me our PR team," he barked at his assistant, "and call our lawyers, all of them. We need to shut this down now." But it was too late. The court of public opinion had already rendered its verdict. As the day wore on, support for the Thompsons snowballed. Veterans groups pledged to form a human chain around the couple's home if any attempt was made to evict them. Legal experts offered their services pro bono, and perhaps most surprisingly, a group of Apex Development employees, led by a young intern named Sarah Goldstein, no relation to Martha, but inspired by her namesake's courage, staged a walkout in solidarity with the Thompsons. By nightfall, Maple Street had transformed into an impromptu vigil. Hundreds of people, many holding candles and signs of support, gathered outside the Thompsons' home. Among them was Jason, who found himself approached by a tall, distinguished-looking man in his 60s. "Mr. Hartley," the man said, extending his hand. "I'm Benjamin Rosenberg, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. I've been following this case closely, and I believe it's time for the highest court in the land to weigh in. Would you be willing to bring this case before us?" Jason's jaw dropped. "Your Honor, of course. Yes, absolutely." As Jason rushed to share the news with the Thompsons, he felt a mix of exhilaration and terror. This was bigger than anything he'd ever handled, bigger than anything most lawyers would handle in their entire careers. Inside their home, Samuel and Martha sat in quiet contemplation, the sounds of the supportive crowd filtering through their windows. "Do you think we did the right thing, Samuel?" Martha asked softly. "Bringing all of this to light after so many years?" Samuel nodded slowly. "I do, my love. For too long the world has tried to forget the horrors of the past. But we cannot build a just future on a foundation of forgotten crimes. Whatever happens now, we've done our part to ensure that the truth is known." As they held each other close, both Samuel and Martha felt a weight lifting, the weight of secrets kept for too long, of injustices unaddressed. Whatever the outcome of the legal battle to come, they had already won a significant victory. They had spoken their truth, and the world had listened. Outside, the crowd began to sing, a spontaneous chorus of "We Shall Overcome" rising into the night air. It was a reminder that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit has an extraordinary capacity for resilience, compassion, and the pursuit of justice. The battle was far from over, but as Samuel and Martha drifted off to sleep that night, they did so with a sense of peace they hadn't known in years. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now they were no longer alone in their fight. A nation had rallied to their cause, and the wheels of justice were finally beginning to turn. As dawn broke over Maple Street, the crowd outside the Thompsons' home had thinned but not disappeared. Dedicated supporters maintained their vigil, while news vans stood ready to capture any developments. Inside, Samuel and Martha were preparing for another day in the spotlight when Jason burst through the door, his face a mix of excitement and disbelief. "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson," he panted, waving a stack of papers. "You're not going to believe this. I've been up all night going through some old records and, well, you need to see this for yourselves." Samuel adjusted his glasses, peering at the documents Jason spread across their kitchen table. Martha leaned in, her brow furrowed in concentration. "What are we looking at, Jason?" Samuel asked, his voice tinged with confusion. Jason took a deep breath. "These are financial records from the late 1940s and early 1950s. They show a series of large, anonymous donations to various Holocaust survivor funds and Jewish resettlement organizations. The amounts are staggering. Millions of dollars, adjusted for inflation." Martha gasped. "But what does this have to do with us?" Jason's eyes gleamed with excitement. "I cross-referenced the dates and amounts with your personal history. Mr. Thompson, do you remember working as a bookkeeper for a small import-export business in New York in 1949? Samuel nodded slowly. "Yes, of course, it was my first real job in America. But it was just a tiny operation, run by another survivor named Jakob Stern," Jason finished for him. Except Jakob Stern wasn't just running a small business. He was the front man for an international network of Holocaust survivors, working to reclaim and redistribute assets stolen by the Nazis. The revelation hung in the air for a moment before Samuel slumped back in his chair, his face pale. I had no idea. I just kept the books. Jakob always said discretion was paramount." Jason nodded eagerly. "And you were the perfect cover, a young immigrant just starting out. No one would suspect you were handling millions in reclaimed assets." Martha reached for her husband's hand. "Samuel, all those late nights you worked, the secret phone calls." Samuel's eyes widened as decades-old memories resurfaced. "I thought I was just helping other survivors get back on their feet. I had no idea of the scale." Jason leaned forward, his voice intense. "Mr. Thompson, according to these records, you weren't just an employee. You were a key figure in this operation. Your signature is on dozens of transfer documents. You helped redistribute millions to survivors and their families across the globe." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Finally, Martha spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "But Jason, what does this mean for our case?" The young lawyer's face broke into a grin. "It changes everything. Mr. Thompson, you're not just a survivor fighting for your home. You're a hero who helped countless others rebuild their lives. And more importantly, you have a direct link to the assets Apex's founders stole during the war." Samuel shook his head, overwhelmed. "But I never knew. I was just doing what I thought was right. And that's what makes it so powerful," Jason insisted. "You've been fighting for justice your entire life, even when you didn't realize it. This isn't just about your home anymore. It's about finishing the work you started over 70 years ago." As the implications of this revelation sank in, a commotion outside caught their attention. Through the window, they could see a sleek black car pulling up, flanked by police escorts. A distinguished-looking man in his 60s emerged, straightening his tie as he approached the house. Jason's eyes widened in recognition. "That's Senator Michael Goldberg. He's the head of the Senate Judiciary Committee." Before anyone could react, there was a knock at the door. Martha moved to answer it, her hands trembling slightly. Senator Goldberg stood on their porch, his expression grave. "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, I apologize for the intrusion, but I've just been briefed on some remarkable information regarding your case. May I come in? There's something of national importance we need to discuss." As the senator entered their modest living room, Samuel and Martha exchanged a look of bewilderment. Their quiet fight to save their home had suddenly thrust them into the center of a story much bigger than they could have imagined. Senator Goldberg cleared his throat. Mr. Thompson, Mrs. Thompson, on behalf of the United States government, I need to ask you some questions about an operation codenamed Phoenix Rising. Does that name mean anything to you? Samuel's face drained of color. It was a phrase he hadn't heard in over 70 years, one he'd sworn never to repeat. As he opened his mouth to respond, he realized that the battle they were fighting was about to take a turn none of them could have anticipated. The quiet suburban street that had been their home for decades was now the epicenter of a story that would rewrite history, challenge the foundations of corporate America, and force a nation to confront the long-buried secrets of its past. The tension in the Thompsons' living room was palpable as Senator Goldberg settled into an armchair, his keen eyes fixed on Samuel. Martha instinctively moved closer to her husband, their hands intertwined in a gesture of unity that had sustained them through decades of hardship. Mr. Thompson, the senator began, his voice low and measured, what I'm about to tell you is classified information, but given recent developments, the president himself has authorized me to bring you into the loop. Samuel nodded slowly, his expression a mixture of apprehension and curiosity. Senator, before you continue, I need to know, is this about Operation Phoenix Rising? A flicker of surprise crossed the senator's face. You're familiar with the name, then? Familiar? Samuel let out a bitter laugh. Senator, I helped create it. The room fell silent as the weight of Samuel's words sank in. Jason, who had been furiously taking notes, looked up in shock. Mr. Thompson, what exactly was Operation Phoenix Rising? Samuel took a deep breath, his eyes distant as he recalled memories long suppressed. It began in the chaos after the war. So many of us had lost everything, our homes, our families, our very identities. But some of us refused to let the Nazis have the final victory. Martha squeezed his hand encouragingly as he continued. We formed a network, survivors, resistance fighters, even some allied intelligence officers who understood what was at stake. Our mission was twofold: to track down Nazi war criminals who had escaped justice, and to reclaim the wealth they had stolen from our people. Senator Goldberg leaned forward, his interest piqued. And how successful were you? A small, proud smile played at the corners of Samuel's mouth. More than anyone ever knew. We operated in the shadows, using the skills we had honed to survive in the camps. We became experts in false identities, in moving money undetected, in piecing together fragments of information to uncover the truth. But surely the government knew something, Jason interjected. An operation of that scale couldn't have gone completely unnoticed. The senator cleared his throat. We had suspicions, rumors, but nothing concrete until now. Mr. Thompson, the documents your lawyer uncovered have opened a Pandora's box. The ties between Apex Development and Nazi-looted assets are just the tip of the iceberg. Samuel's eyes hardened. Then you understand why this fight is so important. It's not just about our home. It's about all the homes, all the lives that were stolen. It's about finally bringing the truth to light. As if on cue, the sound of car doors slamming outside drew everyone's attention. Through the window, they could see a fleet of black SUVs pulling up, men in suits pouring out onto the quiet suburban street. That'll be William Blackstone III and his legal team, Jason said grimly. They must have gotten wind of the senator's visit. Martha stood, her back straight, her chin lifted in defiance. Let them come. We've faced worse than corporate bullies. The doorbell rang, its cheerful chime incongruous with the gravity of the moment. Senator Goldberg moved to answer it, but Samuel held up a hand. No, Senator. This is our home. Allow me. With a strength that belied his years, Samuel Thompson opened the door to face William Blackstone III, CEO of Apex Development. The contrast between them could not have been starker. Blackstone in his tailored suit, flanked by a team of lawyers, facing an elderly man in a cardigan whose only weapon was the truth. Mr. Thompson, Blackstone began, his voice dripping with forced politeness. I think there's been a terrible misunderstanding. Perhaps we could discuss this like reasonable men. Samuel's reply was calm but firm. There's nothing to discuss, Mr. Blackstone. Your company was built on stolen lives and stolen dreams. That ends today. As reporters began to gather, sensing the confrontation brewing, Blackstone's composure slipped. You have no idea who you're dealing with, old man. We'll bury you in litigation. You'll lose everything. A sad smile crossed Samuel's face. Mr. Blackstone, I lost everything once before. What I have now, my home, my dignity, my truth, these are things you can't take away with lawyers or threats. From inside the house, Senator Goldberg emerged, flanked by Jason and Martha. Mr. Blackstone, the senator's voice boomed, I suggest you and your team leave now. The Department of Justice will be in touch regarding a full investigation into Apex Development's origins and practices. As Blackstone and his team retreated, visibly shaken, the street erupted in cheers. Neighbors who had been watching from their porches, supporters who had maintained their vigil, all united in a moment of triumph. But for Samuel and Martha Thompson, this was more than a victory against a corporation. It was the culmination of a lifelong journey, a final act of resistance against the forces that had sought to destroy them so long ago. As the sun began to set on Maple Street, casting a golden glow over the scene, Samuel turned to Martha, tears glistening in his eyes. We did it, meine Liebe. We kept our promise. Martha nodded, her voice thick with emotion. To those who couldn't be here, to those who didn't survive. In that moment, surrounded by allies old and new, Samuel and Martha Thompson stood not just as survivors, but as living testaments to the enduring power of truth, justice, and the unbreakable spirit of those who refuse to be silenced. The battle was far from over, but as night fell on Maple Street, hope burned brighter than it had in decades. The world was watching, and the truth so long buried was finally coming to light. As the first rays of dawn broke over Maple Street, the Thompsons' modest home stood as a beacon of hope and justice. The past 24 hours had been a whirlwind of revelations, confrontations, and unexpected alliances. Now, as a new day began, the real work was about to start. Inside, Samuel and Martha sat at their kitchen table, surrounded by Jason, Senator Goldberg, and a team of Justice Department officials. The air was thick with purpose and determination. Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, one of the officials began, your testimony will be crucial in bringing Apex Development to justice. Are you prepared for what's to come? Samuel reached for Martha's hand, his grip firm despite his years. We've been preparing for this moment our entire lives, he said, his voice steady. We're ready. As the meeting progressed, plans were laid out for a comprehensive investigation into Apex's ties to Nazi-looted assets. But for Samuel and Martha, there was an even greater purpose at stake. It's not enough to just punish Apex, Martha interjected, her eyes blazing with a fire that had sustained her through the darkest times. We need to ensure that something like this can never happen again. Senator Goldberg leaned forward, intrigued. What do you propose, Mrs. Thompson? Samuel and Martha exchanged a look, years of unspoken understanding passing between them. We want to establish a foundation, Samuel explained, one that will work to identify and return stolen assets to Holocaust survivors and their descendants. But more than that, we want to create an educational program to ensure that future generations never forget the cost of hatred and the importance of standing up for what's right. The room fell silent as the weight of their proposal sank in. It was Jason who finally broke the silence, his voice thick with emotion. Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, what you're proposing, it's incredible. But the resources required, a small, knowing smile played at the corners of Samuel's mouth. Young man, did you forget what you discovered about Operation Phoenix Rising? We have resources you can't imagine, funds that have been waiting decades for this very moment. As the day wore on, the Thompsons' living room became a hub of activity. Lawyers drafted documents, government officials made calls, and journalists clamored for statements. Through it all, Samuel and Martha remained a calm center, their unwavering commitment to justice guiding every decision. By nightfall, the framework for the Thompson Foundation for Justice and Remembrance was in place. Its mission: to right historical wrongs, educate future generations, and ensure that the lessons of the past were never forgotten. As the last of the officials left, promising to return the next day to continue their work, Samuel and Martha found themselves alone for the first time in what felt like ages. They stood on their porch, looking out at the quiet street that had been their home for so long. "Did you ever imagine, my love," Martha asked softly, "that our fight would lead us here?" Samuel shook his head, a mix of wonder and sadness in his eyes. "No, I didn't. But I'm grateful that we lived to see this day, that we can finish what we started all those years ago." As they stood there, arm in arm, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was William Blackstone III, looking haggard and defeated. "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what to say. The things I've learned about my family's past, about the company I've led, I had no idea." For a moment, Samuel and Martha said nothing, simply regarding the man who had once threatened to destroy their home and their legacy. Finally, Samuel spoke, his voice gentle but firm. "Mr. Blackstone, the past cannot be changed, but the future, that's still in our hands. What matters now is what you choose to do with the truth you've learned." Tears welled in Blackstone's eyes. "I want to make this right. Tell me how." Martha stepped forward, placing a hand on Blackstone's arm. "Come inside, Mr. Blackstone. We have much to discuss." As they led him into their home, the same home he had once sought to demolish, a profound sense of closure settled over Maple Street. The battle was won, but the real victory lay in the hearts and minds that had been changed. In the days and weeks that followed, the Thompson Foundation became a beacon of hope and reconciliation. William Blackstone III, in a stunning turn of events, became one of its most ardent supporters, using his resources and influence to further its mission. The story of Samuel and Martha Thompson, once confined to the quiet whispers of survivors, became a rallying cry for justice and remembrance across the nation and beyond. Schools incorporated their story into curricula, teaching new generations about the importance of standing up against injustice. And on Maple Street, the modest home of two Holocaust survivors stood as a living testament to the enduring power of truth, resilience, and the unbreakable human spirit. As Samuel and Martha Thompson watched their legacy unfold, they knew that their long journey, from the depths of Auschwitz to the heights of justice, had been worth every step. They had kept their promise, not just to each other, but to all those who had been lost. In the end, their story was not just about surviving, but about thriving, about turning pain into purpose and tragedy into triumph. It was a lesson for the ages, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, the light of truth and justice can never be extinguished. And as the sun set on another day in their beloved home, Samuel turned to Martha, his eyes shining with love and pride. "We did it, meine Liebe," he whispered. "We really did it." Martha nodded, tears of joy streaming down her face. "Yes, my love, we kept our promise, and now the world will remember."
Thank you very much for listening to this story. Comment below what you thought of the ending and from which city you're listening to us. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more, click on the next story that's appearing on your screen now. Leave your like and subscribe to our channel so we can build a huge community that shares inspiring stories together. See you soon.